Welcome to the Top Order Podcast. It's Baldy's cricketing labour of love. This little segment started out 3 years ago. We talked about 5 players per episode for the first couple of years. We got down to 2 of the final 4, probably about 6 months ago, and talked about 2 of the greatest spinners in world Test cricket history, Shane Warne and Murali. We're now on to the final 2. Before we do, a quick word about the algorithm. It stood 3 years ago when we started this. I'm sure there'll be some debate around the entrance into the final 100 on the Top Order Podcast Cricketing Hall of Fame. But we are here to discuss numbers 1 and 2, all coming up after the swish. Stay tuned.
Well, if I could hijack the show to open, mainly because I forgot my microphone, so I apologise to viewers of YouTube to make this awkward between me and Binksy. But I have a little celebration. We actually have turned 4 in the time that we have all not been together, which has been a little while. So the podcast has turned 4. I'm just going to stick that there. And in the spirit of drawing out this podcast even a little bit longer, I've brought for you a gift.
Are you going to like that?
I am going to like that.
That seems dangerous.
But not while we're on air.
Not on my newly waxed table.
Exactly. Now, these are not wines for drinking, as they say in Monty Python. These are wines for laying down and avoiding. But we'll start with you, Raj. For the pettest of pet shots, the cover drive. That one goes to you. Happy 4th birthday.
Thank you.
Binksy, for celebrating your great good work on grounds all around the northern and southern hemisphere, the Iron Horse with the tractor on it goes to you.
Oh, very good.
Now, Stuart, I know you don't drink wine, but I'm going to buy you wine anyway. And so I'm going to give you this, the hunting lodge with the gate on it, and I'm going to give it to you knowing that that's probably the only gate that you'll never go through.
Very nice.
See what I did there?
Very
so
nice.
Anyway, happy 4th birthday, chaps. It's been a fantastic ride, and may there be many more years to come. Many happy returns to you all.
Thank you, Baldy. Well, look, next time, rather than spending half an hour prattling around at fucking New World, why don't you just bring your microphone? But we are going to kick on with it.
I had this sorted months ago. This is months in the making, months in planning.
And he doesn't even get a gift for his own celebration.
Did you buy yourself a bottle of wine?
No, I bought a cake and then I ate it.
Okay.
That's where the candle's from.
Right. This is not in the script, to be honest, so I'm going to go to the run notes.
Let's have a pod.
Let's have a pod. But in terms of, for a quick reminder, we are going to talk about the final 2 in our Cricketing Hall of Fame. So, yeah, it's 3 or so years ago, Baldy put together a very, very detailed set of statistics. We've gone through the greatest Test cricketers in the men's game. So this is Test cricket specific. We're down to the final 2. Mm-hmm. The final 2 are batters. We are going to stick about 12 minutes on the clock for each, but I think we're going to interject between the 2, aren't we? I think through the course of
crossover,
through the course of this podcast. But in terms of format, Baldy, I think we want to hand over really and go through the stats, don't we, for entrant number 2 into the Men's Cricket Hall of Fame.
Thanks, Binksy. So entrant number 2 in the Hall of Fame is Sachin Tendulkar. So he played famously 200 Test matches, so one of the most famous numbers in cricket. 329 innings, 15,921 Test runs at an average of 53.78, a highest score of course, 248 not out, 51 Test centuries to go with, I think, 49 one-day centuries, giving him 100 international centuries across those 2 formats, 68 Test 50s. His average above replacement player is plus 12.96. So for those who have joined the podcast recently, average above replacement player is effectively how much better did Tendulkar average than his peers who were top 6 batters and performed reasonably well themselves in their own right. So he was plus 12.9, which is good enough for 11th all time. So top 10, top 11.
That's actually higher than I would have thought.
And in terms of his peak, so we talked about sort of reaching the pinnacle of cricket, and Tendulkar really did that 3 times in his career. I think 1993 he had a calendar year where he averaged 91.4, 640 runs, 200s, 550s. 99 2000, or the calendar year 99, 10 matches, 1,088 runs. highest score of 217, averaged 68, 500s in the calendar year. And then 10 years later, or 11 years later in 2010, 14 matches, 1,562 runs in the calendar year, highest score of 214, 700s, 550s, averaged 78.1 in 2010. So over a period of almost 17 or 18 years, he's got 3 peaks there in terms of, dominating Test cricket and, a magnificent, a little master.
I think Raj, you should probably have the first word, because I know he's a huge fan of yours. But just before we get to that,
Sachin's a huge fan of Raj.
I'm sure he is.
He is. He absolutely.
I'm sure he is. But I, to sort of frame that discussion, I guess the sheer span of Tendulkar's career is just astonishing. And when I think about, he started Test cricket at 16, played till he was 40. Like, that is just unbelievable. I mean, where were you guys in your cricketing career at 16?
Not anywhere near there. That's for sure. It's very hard when you're talking about Sachin, even the person we're going to talk about after, to not do a sort of this is your life, sort of thing about them. And I've kind of just tried to focus on a couple of things. And that first one I think we should explore is the longevity. Just talking about those peaks that you're talking about, there was 3 peaks over 17 years?
Yeah, so 1993, 99 and 2010. I mean, he debuted, I think, 1989, something like that, ridiculous. Last game in 2013 at age 40. So, he had a 24, 25-year international sporting career, which is almost unheard of, really.
Yeah, absolutely. You asked where I was when I was 16. I actually saw Tendulkar. He played a club game when he was, or a game at my club ground when he was on that first Indian tour of England, Brilliant. I think. And he had the big Morant pads at that point and the bouffant hair and the massive bat as well. Even back then. One of the things I did want to ask Baldy about that sort of longevity, and we've rewarded players throughout the course of this series with their longevity, and then there's a few that have.
Sometimes we've seen kind of once it reaches a certain point. Does it actually even matter?
Does it really matter? I guess what I'm really keen to understand, and we kind of trailed this at the start of the pod. Things have probably evolved even over the course of the 3 years that we've been, trucking our way through the Hall of Fame. I pulled up a set of comparison stats, Baldy, which is Steve Smith. So Steve Smith's just ticked over 100 Test matches for nearly 9,500 Test runs. So if you extrapolate that, if he did have that sort of longevity, he'd go on and get somewhere near 18,000 Test runs and probably clock up over 60 hundreds and close to 80 50s. Strike rates is one that can't be measured as accurately, because I think at the start of Tendulkar's career they weren't really sort of doing the ball by ball. But when you kind of now look at it, are there going to be some of the guys that are in that pantheon now? And we talk about Virat, we talk about maybe Steve Smith, we even maybe talk about a Kane or a Roos. If we, it's really difficult to do, but how can we maybe look at where Sachin might finish when some of these guys have finished their Test cricket careers as well?
Yeah, fascinating question. And I think the longevity of his career in terms of starting at the tender age of 16 and going all the way through to 40. I don't know if he might have been dropped once in his career, but I'm not even sure if he was even dropped once. But certainly he's had fluctuations in form. But if you have a look at it, he did 1,000 runs in a calendar year in 97, 99, 01, 02, 08, and 2010, when he did 1,500 runs in a calendar year. And he kind of tailed off a little bit. He only had sort of 270 runs in his 40th year. But I would be shocked if Steve Smith was still playing Test cricket at 40 or even 37, 38. These guys tend to finish their careers in the domestic T20 circuit nowadays more often than not. So for every Jimmy Anderson, there are a dozen Smith, Russell kind of players that finished playing that shorter form of the game. So I don't think we will see players have as long a career as even Alistair Cook had. 113,000 runs for him, even though he retired at 33, 32, something like that. He's still going around the first class.
And he's an outlier, isn't he, as well, because he played predominantly Test cricket or played a lot of Test cricket.
Exactly.
Whereas that's not really the
done thing now. Yeah, exactly.
At the moment. Sorry, just on that piece as well. If I'm correct, I believe he was the first person to score a double hundred in one-day cricket as well. I know this is the Test Cricket Hall of Fame, but in terms of a legacy, you've got someone who comes in who's swashbuckling, in the late 80s, early 90s, and then he still goes on and scores that first double hundred in 2010, I think it was. That's a massive legacy on the game and where we are now.
I think I've been one of the biggest sort of advocates for why are we putting someone here just because they've played this long. Like, I've been probably the most critical, I think, at going through this process of, they're just here because they've played 100 games and it's not fair on these people. Like the Rabada Broad debate that we had and, all of that kind of stuff. But I actually think for Tendulkar, it's almost the reverse. I think that the 200 tests is such an incredible stat that is really meaningful, and it's almost one of those numbers that becomes such like you said in the intro, it becomes an important number in the way that the next person we're going to talk about, their average becomes such an important number. I think it's almost equally as impressive as as that average number. Even though, like Binksy said, there are many players. Look, there's you've got, if you look through the averages of Test cricketers, Test batters,
he's 20th or something like that, isn't he?
You've got Bradman,
17th.
then you've got the Harry Brooks and the Adam Voges of this world, but then you sort of run into Herbert Sutcliffe, Steve Smith, Wally Hammond, Gary Sobers,
Painter,
Sangakkara, Callis, even Kane Williamson has a better average than Tendulkar. But I do think that the sheer longevity, and 16, he was out there facing, like, it wasn't like he was, let's give him a game against Bangladesh. He was out there against Pakistan with Waqar and Wasim and Imran Khan, and
Australia were pretty good then too.
The other question I probably wanted to ask of you two boys, you've been big advocates of the eye test. I know probably you've exceeded your YouTube bandwidths at home doing research for this section of the pod. How complete a batter do you think Sachin is in the pantheon of those great players? I kind of look at someone like Ponting, who had the ability to play a fantastic on drive, a great pull shot, could sweep, use his feet to the spinners. But then you look at Tendulkar, he had this sort of almost brilliant simplicity about his game. Is there anyone that you've kind of taken a little bit of a look at through the course of the eye test on this segment over the last 6 or 7 years and kind of said, they're better than this guy from just a pure aesthetic?
You know what I was actually thinking about, and I was going to talk about it when we talk about the next person, but some of those great West Indians, in that sort of 50s, 60s, 70s period, the way they flowed through the ball was very different to what was going around at that time, and I think that it is better than, from an eye test, what Tendulkar had, but that's a completely different, the way he grew up, the pitches he played in, even the outlook on how they thought they would score runs. They thought they could score those runs in that way throughout the whole world, which, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka have struggled to do. He was able to adapt and go and even if he had a more, classic's not the right word, a more rudimentary style, a more simplistic style, was able to adapt and still score runs in Australia, in England, in New Zealand.
It's no secret that Bradman is next on the list, right? And if we Bradman, it's Australian guy, batter. He remarked when he watched Sachin that Sachin was the player who most reminded him of himself in terms of style. And the way he played the cover drive in particular, ironic that we've got the bottle of wine here on the desk, but the way he played the cover drive in particular and that kind of, as Bradman described it, that almost rotary style of flowing through the ball, which is very different to the way that modern players play now, where it's almost a sort of a punch style. And Tendulkar was able to do that despite having a very, very heavy bat. He famously had a very, very heavy bat that allowed him to play wonderfully through the ball down the ground, and particularly on low pitches. Having a heavy bat allows you to really hit the ball down the ground. He had tremendously strong wrists, even for a small guy, was able to use leverage to great effect. So I don't think there's anyone who's had, in the modern era that I can remember, a better all-around technique. There have been players who have been more powerful, who've had more compact defences, who in one category or another have exceeded Tendulkar. But if you were to model yourself on one player, I don't think you could go past him really in the modern era.
It's funny, you mentioned Bradman and that what he said, and I watched a good doco actually that was Bradman sort of about Bradman and Tendulkar and about their meeting and all of that kind of stuff. And yeah, Bradman talks glowingly about Tendulkar. Tendulkar does the same about Bradman. But one thing Tendulkar said on there that struck me was he said that he always tried to hit the ball, which, yes, okay, that makes complete sense. But if you think about, when I think about a lot of the players that we've talked about recently in terms of Test cricket, they're trying to leave it. There's a lot of leaving. Obviously not in the Bazball era now, but
not in the Ben Duckett mould.
In the era that Tendulkar was playing, there were the Rahul Dravids. There were players that tried to occupy the crease, and I found it very interesting that Tendulkar said that, yeah, he was always trying to hit the ball. It wasn't, even if it was off the stumps of it, he was trying to feel the bat on the ball. But then you flip that to the thing that I noticed when I was watching him is his balance. He's just so calm, and even like those pushes down the ground, he's got quick bowlers running in at him. He's just a short little jab, flies to the boundary. Yeah, he's awesome to watch.
And just to sort of add to that, and I think it's something that probably isn't covered enough, is the mental aptitude to actually play to the conditions. It's something that we have lost a little bit today because a lot of pitches are very similar when you go to different parts of the world. But the fact that if he needed to put that cover drive away, he could. Mm. If he needed to sit on the back foot and ramp it over the slips, he could. He was able to take certain shots out of his game to minimise the chances of him getting out. That's a skill that I don't think is talked about enough with him, and it's something that's lost in a few of our, batsmen these days, I believe.
Well, and on the mental side, I mean, he meant the world to a billion people, right? I don't think that should be underestimated.
Yeah, and I probably want to ask that question last when we talk. As we said, no spoilers. Bradman's next, but let's talk about the legacy and probably that impact on the game, because I think that's going to be a good final question. But let's talk about the Don. Baldy, you're going to run through the stats in a moment. Mm-hmm. I look at, just because it's me, I've tried my best to find a way to argue that he's not number one on this list, and there isn't a single statistic there that would support even half an argument around that, whether it's top score, conversion rates. You look at his first class record, it's just insane that he played 234 first class games, 28,000 runs, and still averaged over 95. But talk us through those stats, and particularly let's look at, I think, the one that's going to make us fall off our chair, which is that comparison with his era.
Yeah, so I mean, there's lots of famous numbers in Bradman's career history role. There's lots of famous numbers in cricket. 87, 111, 200, but probably the most famous of them all is his batting average, 99.94, 52 tests, 80 innings, 6,996 runs at 99.94, a highest test score of 334. He made 309 of those in a day. He made 100 of them before lunch on that day in 1930. That's of his 29 hundreds. I think that's 14th of all time. He's got 12 double hundreds. That's first all time. He's got 2 triple hundreds. That's also first all time. All of that in only 18 innings. Only 13 50s. So his conversion rate of hundreds to 50s is better than 2 to 1, which is extraordinary. He scored 100 once every 3 innings or better. So if we think about when we grew up watching Ashes Test series that were 6 Test series in the 80s and 90s, he would average 400s in 12 bats on average, and on average one of those would be a double, and every second series or every third series one of those would be a triple. So that's the kind of prolific rate at which he scored runs, to the point where newspapers across Australia and England would run "he's out" on the front page of the newspaper, and gate takings would famously double. If Bradman was playing, you'd pay sixpence or whatever it was, and you'd be paying half of that when he didn't play. So just to run through some of the firsts, the top records: most runs in a series by a captain, highest career batting average, fastest to 2,000 runs, fastest to 3,000 runs, fastest to 4,000 runs, fastest to 5,000 runs, fastest to 6,000 runs. He would have been fastest to 7,000 runs, but famously in his last innings, needing only 4 to average 100 for his career. Poignantly, he was bowled by a googly for a duck. lots and lots of conjecture as to whether or not he was crying, and he was, visibly upset because he had a standing ovation and a guard of honour from the England players. He denies that. A couple of others: most runs in a series, 974 runs in a 5-test series. Like I said, most runs in a day, 309, and I think there's only 6 players that have ever scored 100 on day one of a test match before lunch. So look, there's so many superlatives. The one that stood out for me was a 2004 survey that was done across not just cricket but a number of sports, and they used modelling for extreme weather events. So it was like a hydraulic systems, rainfall, flooding system thing, to try and identify outliers in sport. So they looked at a whole bunch of different sports and golf and basketball and Major League Baseball. They looked at hockey, so they looked at the likes of Wayne Gretzky, Jack Nicklaus, Michael Jordan, David Campese from a rugby perspective. The average above replacement player, the thing that we keep talking about, the number of standard deviations that Bradman was away from his peers was not just the most in cricket history. It's actually the highest number of standard deviations away from any professional sporting cohort of any sportsman ever. The only comp that I could find was a 555 match streak by Pakistan's Janangir Khan for squash between 1981 and 1986. Won 555 matches straight. That's the only kind of standout professional sporting performance that I can think of that's that far above their peers. To give you an example, I tried to find a list of players who averaged kind of mid-40s in Test cricket. So if you have a look at Cook averaged 45, Tendulkar averaged 53, you put those together and they averaged 98 and Bradman averaged 99. That's how far above his peers they were. And it doesn't matter what era you look at, he's still light years above his peers. There's heaps of different arguments that you can make for whether or not pitches, equipment, athleticism, sports science, nutrition, the weight of expectation that players like Tendulkar had compared to Bradman. But all of the arguments, I think, boil down to is that he was just that much better than his peers at the time. It's very hard to find a comp for him.
What's the actual number in terms of runs? You gave us Tendulkar's before. It was 11 point something or 12 something you said.
Oh, Bradman's average above replacement player.
Yeah.
I've got it here. Let me just scroll across to it. Plus 52.12.
Yeah, okay.
Do you have the next one?
So he's essentially...
What's second?
Second, yeah, I'll find second for you. I think it's like 15 or 16.
Yeah. So he's like Viv Richards better than
everyone else in the world. Yeah. It's one of the there was some great lines from that ABC doco that I watched, and someone said, Bradman had more records than a gramophone. I thought I enjoyed that one. And when he met Tendulkar, this is quite a famous yarn you guys might have heard, but when him and Tendulkar met, Tendulkar said to him, what do you think you would have averaged these days, Sir Don? And he goes, around 70. And Tendulkar goes, why 70? He goes, 70 is not too bad for a 90-year-old. And there's other stories, actually, like that's obviously a joke, but there's other stories of like Jeff Thompson bowling to him when he was about 60-something, bowling spin and then, then bowling a few little mediums at him. And then going, we could use this guy tomorrow. So he obviously, was still a quality player and could still hold his own at an advanced age.
It's actually interesting, you're hearing all these numbers, these records, and I don't think that I'm finding it as impressive as it actually is because I can't comprehend it all, if you know what I mean. How far above he was of his peers, and just
would you like a Olympic swimming pools version of it?
Yes.
He's that far above his peers that he is in like if you just put it in top 6 batsmen who've played Test cricket, who've averaged 40, he's 1 in 506 million. So statistically, in the history of the humankind, he comes along twice. If Test cricket had been played for the entirety of the existence of human beings, there'd be 2 of this guy. That's how rare this particular,
So you're telling me he's not actually unique?
If he wasn't, it would be him and Tyrannosaurus Bradman.
I want to be slightly controversial.
Go for it.
Let's move on a little bit and talk about legacies of these two players. And I guess I'll frame this in the following way, Baldy. You're Australian, so I think you can, you actually speak for all Australians on this podcast, and that's, that's well established. Famously, he wasn't particularly well liked within the game. How much of that selfishness or self determination or whatever word you want to use do you think contributed to his greatness on the field? And does it actually have an impact on his legacy when when there is going to be the ABC documentary on the 5 greatest Australian cricketers? He's going to be in it every single time. But is he going to be the one that's most revered when you put him into the company of a Shane Warne or a Benno, so that some of the players that have probably done heaps of stuff. They've had their controversy, but they've been involved in the media, they've been involved in other bits and pieces, and probably have had arguably a different and more positive legacy on the game.
In answering that, can you also, because something I had down was I'm quite fascinated to know what you heard about him when you were growing up, because I feel like obviously none of us saw him. We've seen clips now of his batting, but what was the aura of Don Bradman over Australian cricket when you were a youngster?
It was so much so that I vividly remember, and I can tell you exactly what the ground looks like at Bowral at the Bradman Museum, and was very fortunate when I was about 9 or 10 years old. Dad took me down and we spent the morning at the Bradman Museum in Bowral. We walked around the ground. I think they weren't playing that day, but we couldn't get on the centre square. But we were able to walk around under the trees and walk around onto the ground and so forth. So in terms of Australian cricketing pilgrimages to Mecca, other than going to the MCG for a Boxing Day Test match, I've kind of ticked the box, and that's a memory that will live with me forever. Don Bradman, in many Australian cricketing kids' minds, is romanticised as the ultimate boy growing up in a very, very poor upbringing. Famously used the corrugated iron shed and a golf ball and a stump to train his eye and train his technique. His legacy in terms of the way he impacted Australian cricket, I think, has been underrepresented over the history of time, in that he was a very, very influential and forward-thinking administrator for cricket. So if you think about Australia's role in World Series cricket, or the Packer role in World Series cricket, Bradman was for pushing the game of cricket forward. He was unpopular with his peers. I think there is a certain element of reluctance, leadership thrust upon him, rather than him necessarily being a ready-made born leader. Very, very shy person. So I think leadership sat uncomfortably with him. And I think if you look at Tendulkar and Bradman, I think Tendulkar bore the weight of expectation and the weight of leadership maybe a little bit better than he did on the playing field. But certainly, it's worth recognising that Bradman had a terrific impact on pushing Australian cricket forward in an era where a lot of cricket administrators were, in it for the status quo and the old boys network. So he ruffled a few feathers along the way, I'm sure.
Well, and I will just put a plug into Don's camp there, that he also was very well known for answering every letter that came to him. And I actually tested this out when I was about 13, 14, sent him a little cricket card I had of Don Bradman. I think I just sent it to Don Bradman Australia or something, because I couldn't find his address back in those days. A couple of months later, got it back, signed by Don Bradman. So, maybe ruffled some feathers along the way, but certainly seemed to understand his importance in Australian sporting history and kind of lent into that. So
either that or your mum signed it and sent it back.
No.
That's what I was going to say. Sure, your mum or dad didn't do it.
Pretty confident.
And from a legacy perspective, we've got to the end of the 100 cricketers. In terms of, I guess, the numbers, Baldy, these two are definitely at the top table. If this is, the Hall of Fame wedding, or gathering at the St Peter's Gates in 100 years' time, they're sitting next to each other on the top table. Do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. In every way that matters, I think Bradman and Tendulkar are the best two cricketers that have ever lived. in they were. It feels to me, and I've never met either of them, but it feels to me genuinely good people. I mean, the amount of great good work that Tendulkar's done over the course of his career, both on and off the field, is
member of Parliament, I think, for a period of time.
Is outstanding. Both of them led their country, had the weight of expectation on their shoulders through a billion people, through the Great Depression, carried the weight of Australia's hopes and expectations, and hopes for a better life through sport. Both players carried that burden, and very rarely do you find a cricketer that, particularly with Tendulkar, I think, carries himself with as much grace through that expectation. You never once heard of him having a tantrum or having a bad day or having a niggle at another player or losing his cool. His ability through 200 test matches to go through that pretty much unblemished in terms of his on and off field record is quite remarkable, really.
And I think if you add to that, he retired, I think you said in 2013 or something like that.
Test cricket.
From Test cricket. Obviously carried on in the IPL, but he's still around and still a highly visible character, and seems to have actually maintained that. Approachability might be the wrong word, but certainly you feel as if the Indian people particularly feel connected to him, feel as if he's still really, really well revered. And you don't always find that with players who've kind of retired from the game. They become a little bit bitter and twisted, like a Jeffrey Boycott or someone like that. So
it's incredible. I mean, you look all around sport, it's incredibly hard to remain at the top of your game. There's countless examples to remain at the top of your game with that so much love for you as a person and for what you've done. So
I would completely agree. And look, it's very difficult, I think, for us to sum up the careers of these two great cricketers in 25 to 30 minutes. We could spend hours talking about them both. I just want to reassure listeners that even though we might not have covered, back foot no ball, uncovered wickets, athleticism of bowlers, fielders, all of that kind of stuff.
Only playing a few different nations.
Exactly. Depth of opposition, all of that stuff. It's all been considered in terms of bringing this comparison of players together. So much so that I actually went and simulated, what would have happened if Bradman hadn't missed, his age 31 to 35 with the war, which he did, right? He didn't play cricket for 6 years in his peak. Tendulkar, played 25 years. What would have happened if he played 50 tests? What would have happened if Bradman played the same number of tests? So it's all there in the background, but it's, unfortunately we're going to bury the lead here, and some of that stuff will never see the light of day other than the depths of the cloud. So, but what I wanted to convey to the viewers and the listeners is that, of these two in particular, I spent a long time, and this was 4 or 5 years, bringing all of that thinking together, and I think I got this one right. I think it's the only one I got right, but only just.
Well, and the fortunate thing about even Bradman, I think, is that there's actually a decent amount of footage out there on him of someone, in his era. So, if you don't believe Baldy's algorithm, then you should definitely go in and check out YouTube. I mean, I don't know, you talked about YouTube before, but I've certainly spent a good few hours looking at Tendulkar this past couple of weeks, just sort of kind of remembering what I loved watching him as a child. So, beautiful stuff.
Awesome. Well, Baldy, we've sat next to each other on a lot of episodes of this now, probably in excess of 15 or 20 cricketing Hall of Fames. Just want to reiterate to viewers and listeners, the spreadsheets, the algorithms, the amount of preparation that's gone into this from Michael certainly has been profound. I'm a sort of one page of notes whilst I'm eating a bowl of cereal in the morning to prepare for this, and a little bit of YouTube to get that eye test. But this has been truly eye-opening in terms of some of the statistics that we've come up with. And
it's been so much fun, Baldy. Thanks very much, mate.
And particularly that average above replacement power, to think that Bradman's is in excess of 50 really just shows that no matter what the algorithm, he was always going to be at the top, an Australian at the top. Who would have guessed it as we came into this cricketing labour of love? But that is all from us here on the Top Order podcast, the Cricketing Hall of Fame for men's Test cricketers. I'm sure once you've deleted some of the hard drives, Baldy, you'll start the next next version of this, whatever that may be, and I'm sure it'll pop up on your podcast feed over the course of the next 6 or 7 years. But we will be back next week with This Week in Cricket. There's plenty going on. We've got Kane Williamson's fitness is probably 2 weeks away from being decided. World Cup squads galore, and our preview of that white ball tournament coming up in your podcast feed pretty soon. Also, some one-day international cricket going on and T20 cricket going on with New Zealand in England at the moment as well. So plenty to cover on the cricketing airwaves. But for now, it's good night and God bless from us all here in Auckland. See you soon. Good night.